They didn't just sell her, they burned her first, just to remind her she was worth less than a horse. This isn't a story for the faint-hearted. This is what happens when cruelty becomes a business, and silence becomes a weapon. Nalia wasn't kidnapped once. She was sold 3 times each time for less than a crate of ammo. And when she tried to run, they branded her arm with hot iron like livestock and forced her to watch her sister being dragged away into the dark. She didn't scream. She swore she'd survive. And she did, but barely. She stumbled into a frozen river with half her face bruised. Barefoot, ribs cracked, and blood dried between her legs. What she didn't expect was to be found by a man who had buried both his wife and daughter. A man who had nothing left to give. And yet, gave her a fire, a blanket, and a reason to breathe again. But don't think this is some sweet little rescue tale. This story burns, because the men who sold her, they came back, and they brought her past with them. Before we dive into this wild and gut-wrenching ride, do this one thing. If this story hits something inside you, comment 1 and subscribe right now. If not, tap like anyway. She earned it. And whatever you do, stay to the end. There's a moment coming that'll rip your heart wide open. They found her half buried beneath a rotting tarp outside a smuggler's checkpoint in Nevada territory, not to save her, but to shut her up. The cartel that ran the borderlands didn't just sell women. They erased them. Changed their names, carved their skin, broke their legs so they couldn't run. Nalia was supposed to be next. She was lot 37-inch their inventory, just another body with light eyes and compliant silence. But when they came to move her across state lines, she snapped a chain to the guard's throat and vanished barefoot into the snow. What the buyers didn't know was that she'd memorized the smuggling route, every clearing, every pit stop, every crooked tree. She'd spent months pretending to be broken just to learn where the cracks were. And when the blizzard hit, she used it like a weapon. She wasn't running towards safety. She was running away from being owned. For 2 nights, she crawled through timber country, no coat, no shoes, her wrists still raw from metal cuffs. Coyotes followed her scent. Once, she blacked out from blood loss, woke up with frostbitten toes and a dead bird frozen beside her. But she kept going, because what waited behind her was worse than what lay ahead. She didn't expect a cabin. She didn't expect a man. And she definitely didn't expect him. Calder Rowan wasn't the kind of man you trusted easily. He was tall, silent, and moved like a bear coming out of winter slow. But dangerous. He carried grief like it was sewn into his coat. People in the valley whispered about him. That he drank alone on his porch. And once buried his wife and daughter the same week without asking for a single hand to help. But when he opened the door and found Nalia collapsed against his steps, bleeding and barefoot with ice in her hair, he didn't blink. He picked her up, carried her in, and said nothing. No questions, no judgments, just a fire and a blanket. The first human warmth she'd felt in over a year. She didn't trust it. For the first 72 hours, she slept with a blade she'd stolen from his kitchen. Every time he walked past, she tracked him with the eyes of someone who'd been sold too many times to count. She didn't speak. She didn't eat unless he left the room. But Calder never touched her, never asked her name, never even looked twice when the coat slipped off her shoulder and revealed the bruises the snow hadn't erased. Instead, he gave her space. And that was more terrifying than violence. Because kindness. She didn't know how to survive that. Then, one morning, as he handed her hot broth with trembling hands, she whispered her name. Just one word. But it shook something loose. And from that moment, the silence between them stopped being empty and became the safest place she'd ever known. But the world doesn't let survivors breathe for long, because the men she'd escaped, they weren't done with her yet, and they had plans for the man who dared to give her shelter. That's Dudod. The first real sound Calder heard that morning was the sharp crack of metal against bone. He was outside chopping wood when Nalia screamed not out of fear, but fury, and when he rushed back to the cabin, he found her holding a skillet like a weapon, standing over a man writhing on the floor with a broken wrist and a busted lip. Blood splattered across the rug. A second man, younger, thinner, stood frozen in the doorway, eyes wide, hands raised. Calder didn't hesitate. He grabbed the rifle from the mantel, cocked it, and leveled it without saying a word. The boy dropped to his knees. "Please, we just came for her," he stammered. Nalia's breath came in short bursts. Her body trembled, not from weakness, but restraint. Her lips were cracked, her arms covered in half-healed bruises and makeshift bandages. Yet, in that moment, she looked like a ghost returned for vengeance. Beautiful, dangerous, untouchable. The man on the floor moaned something in Spanish. Nalia responded with a single, vicious kick to his ribs. "He called me property," she said coldly, "and said he had the receipt." The younger one cried harder. "They'll kill me if I go back without her." "Then don't go back," Calder said, voice low, controlled. "And if either of you step foot near this land again, I'll bury you so deep even your ghosts won't find the way out." They left limping, one clutching a shattered wrist, the other barely able to run. Calder didn't ask for details. He didn't need to. The way Nalia stood there, breathless and shaking, told him everything. But later, when the adrenaline faded, she collapsed beside the hearth, arms wrapped around her knees. She didn't cry, not yet, but her voice shook when she whispered, "They're not just traffickers. They're contractors." Calder stiffened. "Contractors for what?" "For people like me," she said. "But also for girls younger. Girls with blue eyes, green eyes. Some boys, too. They call it processing. They sort us into vans and give us numbers. And the ones who don't behave." Her voice trailed off. "Some of them don't even make it out of the warehouse." He sat down beside her in silence, fists clenched so tight the scars on his knuckles turned white. She wasn't just running from some backwater gang. This was an organized network, one with reach, funding, and people who operated with quiet impunity. The law didn't chase them. The border looked the other way. And when a girl went missing, she was often labeled a runaway, even if she'd been stolen from her own backyard. "Do you have any idea how many ranchers just look the other way?" she said suddenly. "How many men take payment in livestock or grain to let a truck pass through their land?" She looked at him, eyes raw. "You didn't. And that makes you dangerous." That night, she didn't sleep. Neither did he. She spent hours by the window, watching for headlights or shadows on the ridge. Calder cleaned his rifle with mechanical precision, again and again, though it didn't need it. Just something to do while the weight of the truth pressed on them like smoke too thick to breathe. The next morning, the fence line was littered with tire tracks. Deep ones. Fresh. Calder followed them up the trail, with Nalia riding behind him, her arms wrapped tight around his waist. She hadn't asked to come, she insisted. When they reached the ridge, they found the carcass of one of Calder's cows throat slit, eyes removed, hooves scorched. Not for theft. For message. Pinned to its flank with a hunting knife was a note written in Spanish and English. "You took what was paid for. We take interest." Nalia didn't blink. She didn't speak. She simply dismounted, walked to the cow, and knelt beside it in the dirt. Calder watched her lay her palm gently over its head, whisper something in Apache, and then stand up straighter than he'd ever seen her. "I'm not going back underground," she said. "You won't," he answered. But inside, his gut twisted. Because he knew what came next. These men weren't sloppy anymore. They'd made contact. They'd left a marker. And that meant more were coming. They rode back fast and quiet. Calder began preparing for siege, nailing boards across windows, stockpiling water, sharpening axes, and placing spare ammo rounds in a hidden trapdoor under the floor. Nalia cleaned her blade and soaked cloth in vinegar, grinding sumac and wild herbs into healing salves, like a woman raised by fire, not fear. Later, after the final nail was driven into the barn door, they sat together at the edge of the porch, their boots caked in mud, the world around them too quiet for comfort. "I used to think I was just unlucky," she said, voice low. "Like bad things followed me because I was weak." "You're not weak," he replied. "Number. But I was hunted, and I got tired of running." The wind moved through the trees like whispers. Her fingers brushed his, tentative at first. Then firmer, not for romance, but for solidarity. Two people scarred by systems, not just accidents. Two people who had both been told, in different ways, to disappear. "I want to fight back," she said finally. "But not just for me. There are girls still in those cages. And someone's got to make the men who build them feel fear again." Calder turned to her, studying the reflection of the firelight in her eyes. "Then we start here." He meant it. Not with speeches. not with revenge fantasies, but with survival as resistance and truth as a blade. The quiet wouldn't last. They knew that now. But the next time men came with trucks and ledgers and blood-stained boots, they wouldn't find a scared girl in the woods. They'd find a woman who refused to be bought and a man with nothing left to lose. And neither one of them would run. Alder, it started with smoke. Not the warm kind that curled from Calder's hearth, but the sour, oily kind that meant something unnatural was burning. It rolled low over the trees that morning, thick and dark, carried by a wind that didn't belong. Nalia smelled it first. She was grinding root bark into medicine when her body went still. Then she stood slowly, like an animal sensing a predator before it saw it. They found the first fire in the western woods, just beyond the ridgeline. A half-burned hunting cabin. A warning. Calder didn't say much. He didn't have to. He grabbed the rifle, a pack, and the last map he owned of the region. Nalia followed close, still limping from frostbite, but steady. Her eyes were sharper now, her posture straighter. She no longer flinched when thunder cracked. But that morning, she did something new. She tucked the small blade into her waistband in front of her, not hidden at her back. Not running. Waiting. The fire wasn't random. It was lit in a circle, ritualistic, fast-burning accelerant, poured in lines that snaked around the structure like a brand. And on the wall, scrawled in coal-black ash, a message. Traitor ranchers burned too. Whoever these men were, they weren't just looking to reclaim Nalia. They were declaring war. She walked through the ashes in silence, stopping where a half-melted iron branding rod lay. She didn't pick it up, just stared. That's what they used on us, she said finally. Some of the girls, they stopped crying after the second mark. The third time, they didn't even move. You burn something enough. It forgets it was ever meant to feel. Calder's jaw clenched so tight it cracked. He looked away. They think this will scare us, he said. It does, she answered. But not the way they want. That night, they didn't speak much. Calder patched the barn roof. Nalia boiled water and sharpened the broken handle of a hatchet into a stabbing wedge. She lined the windows with shards of mirror, anything to catch a glint, a movement, a shape. But the real change happened inside her. That night, for the first time, she packed a go bag. Not to run, but to find them. She gathered herbs that could knock a man unconscious, wrapped flint and twine into her belt. She even asked Calder how to load the old revolver in his drawer, not out of fear, but precision. I won't shoot unless I have to, she said. He nodded. But if you do, shoot to stop breathing. She nodded once. Later, after the fire had died down and the stars hung quiet above the trees, Nalia sat outside alone, a thick blanket wrapped over her shoulders. She stared up at the moon, her jaw locked, her eyes wet but not soft. I remember one of the girls, she said quietly when Calder stepped out behind her. Her name was Ellie. She was 12, had freckles, and this laugh like a creek in summer. When she fought back, they made us watch. Calder didn't interrupt. He sat beside her, listening. She didn't scream either, just looked right at them and said, My name's Ellie, and you can't kill that. Nalia looked down at her hands. They buried her in a ditch. She paused. But I still remember her name. That's how we fight back, Calder. We remember them. We don't just survive for ourselves. We survive for the ones they buried nameless. By the next morning, a decision had taken shape. They wouldn't wait for war to arrive. They would intercept it. With the fire line approaching and the land around them no longer safe, Calder saddled the horse and packed supplies for two. They would move toward the foothills to an old U.S. Army watch station. He remembered from the war, abandoned, but stocked with essentials. From there, they'd plan. But Nalia had one condition. If we find other girls like me, we don't leave them behind. Ondering. He nodded. We don't leave anyone. They left that afternoon not just as survivors, but as insurgents. Two figures on horseback, disappearing into the brush, carrying no flag only, truth, pain, and the will to carve justice where the law had gone blind. If this chapter left a mark on your heart, type Ellie in the comments to honor those still fighting to be seen. And stay with us, because in the next part, they're not the only ones hunting. Aller. The foothills were colder than expected, the wind slicing through the pines like knives. Calder and Nalia moved silently along the narrow ridge path, the horse's hooves muffled by a thin layer of frost. By the time they reached the abandoned watch station, the sun was sinking, bleeding red across the horizon, the kind of sky that looked like fire had claimed it. The station was nothing more than a weathered cabin and a crumbling tower, relics from a war that had long since been forgotten by everyone but Calder. As they approached, Nalia's gaze hardened. There were signs of life, a small fire pit still warm, boot prints in the mud, and a piece of cloth snagged on the doorway. Calder lifted his rifle instantly, his instincts honed by years of loss and war. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with the faint stench of kerosene and blood. A rusty tin cup lay overturned on the table. Then, they found her. A young woman, barely 16, huddled in the corner, hands bound with frayed rope, lips cracked and bleeding. Her eyes widened at the sight of them, wild and distrustful, like a cornered animal. Nalia knelt first, speaking softly in Apache. The girl's shoulders trembled, and for a moment the fear in her eyes cracked. She whispered a single name. Maris. It took a few seconds for Nalia to realize what that meant. Maris was one of the girls from the processing routes, one of the missing faces burned into her memory during those endless nights of captivity. The realization hit like a bullet. Nalia's pulse spiked with rage. They left her here to starve, Nalia said, her voice shaking, but not from fear. Like bait. Calder's eyes swept the tree line through the window. Then they're close. The trap was set before they even lit a fire. 3 men emerged from the woods at dusk. Silhouettes framed against the dying light. They didn't rush. They moved with the slow confidence of hunters, weapons slung over their shoulders. One of them tall, scar-faced, with a black hat pulled low, carried the kind of smile that meant trouble. He called out in English, voice dripping with mockery. You're holding what belongs to us. Calder stepped outside, rifle raised but steady. She belongs to nobody. The man chuckled, glancing at the cabin where Nalia stood just behind the door, Maris trembling under a blanket. You've got 2 of ours now. That's theft. You sold your right to breathe the second you put a price on them. Calder shot back. The standoff burned cold and quiet. Then, without warning, a shot rang out. The bullet slammed into the porch post inches from Calder's head. He dropped to the ground, rolled, and returned fire. The crack of the rifle echoed across the hills, shaking the silence apart. Nalia dragged Maris deeper into the cabin, grabbing the revolver Calder had taught her to load. Her hands trembled, but her aim didn't. When one of the men tried to flank the cabin, Nalia stepped outside, rage blazing hotter than the fear. She fired once, the sound sharp and final. The man dropped into the snow, his hat tumbling into the dirt. For a brief, breathless second, everything froze, even the wind. Calder's voice cut through it. You're not taking anyone. The survivors ran, leaving their fallen behind. The snow had barely stopped steaming around the dead man's body when Calder knelt beside him, fingers moving through the folds of his coat with methodical anger. He found a badge, not a lawman's, but something far more damning. A polished brass emblem, stamped with a wolf's head and the letters ACS. Nalia stepped forward, gun still warm in her hand. Her breath caught when she saw it. Asset Control Syndicate, she whispered. They're not smugglers, they're federal contractors. Calder stared at her. You're telling me this was sanctioned? No, she said. Worse, privatized. That word landed like a punch to the ribs. She explained between breaths how the U.S. government had quietly begun outsourcing containment of undocumented or unclaimed persons on tribal lands to private entities. How these men weren't rogue. They were funded, equipped, protected. And how any girl without a name in the system, Apache, Métis, Cree, was fair game for reassignment. You kill them, nothing happens, she said. But if they kill you, it's just a cleanup report. The wind howled through the trees, lifting the edge of the blanket Maris had wrapped around herself. She sat silently behind them, still too weak to speak. But her eyes were focused now, not wild with fear, but sharpened with something else. Awareness. They burned the body at dawn, not out of ritual, but refusal. No burial, no marker, no legacy. Nalia lit the pyre herself, hands steady, face blank. Calder didn't stop her. There was something sacred in her silence, something ancient in her rage. When the flames had burned low and the wind carried the last of the smoke eastward, Calder turned to her. "They'll come back. With more." "I know," she said. "We can't just hide. I'm done hiding." She looked down at Maris, who had begun to drift in and out of fever. Her skin was pale, lips dry, but her grip on Nalia's hand was tight. Nalia smoothed the girl's hair back. "We're not the only ones," she added. "There are more like her, more girls, some taken last week, some years ago, some who think no one's coming." Calder was quiet. Then he walked into the watch station and came out with a folded map and a marker. He knelt on the porch, spread it flat, and began circling regions known smuggling routes, borderland trails, old depots, and burned-out ranger stations. "We can't hit them head-on," he said. "But we can make them bleed. We find the safe houses, we break the routes, and we take whoever's inside with us." Nalia stood beside him. "We don't need a war," she said. "Just enough fire to make them back off." "No," Calder said. "We need enough fire to make them answer." That night, Maris finally spoke. Her voice was raw, and her first words were, "My sister's still in there." The way she said it, not a plea, not a hope, but a fact, cracked something inside Nalia she thought had long calcified. She remembered the night she had crawled across the frozen dirt, half conscious, whispering her own sister's name into the snow, and how no one had answered. Now she would. They left the next morning. Maris stayed with an old widow in a logging camp nearby, a friend of Calder's late wife, who owed him more favors than he ever asked to collect. The girl didn't cry when they left. She only said, "Find her." The raid happened 3 nights later. An unmarked house tucked deep in the woods near the Montana border. A false orphanage on paper, safe Pine Haven for displaced youth, run by a man who wore a cross on his lapel and a revolver on his hip. They breached the gate in silence. Calder cut the power. Nalia slipped through the back, blade drawn. Fire in her blood. Inside, they found 8 girls. Most were drugged. 2 had bruises across their ribs. 1 had her hands zip-tied to a radiator. Calder guarded the door. Nalia freed the girls. Then, in the hallway, she found him, the man with the revolver, half-dressed, hands stained with whatever lies he told himself. He reached for his gun. She didn't hesitate. 1 shot to the chest. He hit the floor with a gasp and a spatter of blood on the doorframe. He blinked once, then stilled. She didn't look away. They disappeared by sunrise, leaving no names, no signatures, only a house emptied of silence and filled with ghosted memories. It wasn't over. It wouldn't be for a long time. But as the girls rode in the wagon behind them, huddled in coats and blankets, Nalia looked back at Calder, eyes weary but awake. "We'll need more room. We'll build more." She reached for his hand, not for reassurance, but alliance. For the first time since she was dragged into the world like a thing to be sold, Nalia felt what the traffickers could never understand: she belonged to no one. But she could choose where she stood, and now she stood with them, with every girl reclaimed from darkness, with every name no longer erased, with fire in her hands and freedom in her blood. And this story teaches us that survival alone is not enough. Dignity must be reclaimed, not just preserved. Nalia's journey shows that silence protects the oppressor, but memory empowers the survivor. Through her rage, not weakness, she finds purpose. Justice isn't delivered by systems, but by those brave enough to stand where others turn away. Calder's quiet strength and refusal to look away reminds us that real love never seeks to possess, only to protect. In a world that dehumanizes the broken, this story is a battle cry. We are not what they did to us, we are what we choose to become after.